we have kind of gathered. So good morning, everybody. I'm really thrilled to have Professor Kieran Keohane of UCC with us today. It feels unusual to do such a formal introduction to him because, of course, this is originally his summer school and his venture, so he's known to us all. So I might just mention that our final talk, so this is the second last of the ENS talk, so it has been a marathon for many of us, but I think a really rich and interesting one. Our final talk is Damien O'Doherty on the Leviathan of Rationality, and that's on the 11th at 10 a.m. But I'll just hand it over to Kieran. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ray. Marie, will you share our slides? That's great. Okay, thanks. Ray, thanks for your kind words. It's interesting that the Economy Society Summer School is a conversation, and I guess that's kind of my theme today. In some ways, it's interesting to be in the position of being amongst the last speakers, because I suppose our work is also about keeping the conversation going, and we're keeping this conversation going despite the difficulties of the present circumstances and so on. So kind of closing words are also kind of words for beginning again. And it's been a very interesting and ongoing conversation in that regard. And I have some, I suppose, responsibility for collaborating with everybody in enabling that conversation to continue. We don't know whether we'll be returning to our in real life form. Hopefully we will. But it's interesting even to reflect on that. What's the difference between a summer school, for instance, and a lecture and all of that? And I'm sitting here in sunshine, and I remember that pretty much all of our summer schools over the last 10, 12 years or so have been in glorious sunshine. It's a beginning of summer occasion, and that's been something that's been really beautiful about it. And I think even on our second to last day is usually when we go for a walk and we turn this summer school into a walking, talking conversation, which is all important to remember while we're sitting and virtually mediated and so on. So I want to kind of speak in that spirit. I'm also conscious of the fact that I'm speaking in lieu of somebody else. I'm speaking in lieu of Maggie O'Neill, and I want to kind of be aware of that. You know, that sometimes when you're speaking, especially in the context of a summer school, you're not simply giving a lecture, which is kind of reading something, as it were, but you're trying to shape and trying to influence an ongoing conversation. And that means you have responsibilities to an inheritance of what we've been doing, and also present and current influences and conversations and so on, with a view also to articulating some sort of a hope for the future. And that's kind of what I have in mind here. And as you know, I pre-circulated a paper recently published in a journal called Constellations. And I'm not going to read that paper, right? I'm presuming that that's kind of background reading and so on. I'll say a little bit about it, but hopefully what I'm trying to do is kind of build on that in some way. So what I want to pick up from that and kind of add to the conversation as a sort of going forward and carrying forward and so on, carrying forward influences and then shaping them or making them grow in some sort of a way. I'll give you the title of Good Models and Positive Mimesis, Hopeful Grounds and Horizons for Economy and Society After COVID-19. I'm scheduled to receive my vaccinations in a couple of weeks, and you know, that kind of changes one's mind in some sort of a way. I have to say, I don't know if you share this experience, but it's actually very difficult to maintain focus, to maintain coherence of mind under these circumstances. And I want to suggest that that's very largely due to the dissolution of the possibility of conversation, or as it were, the recoding of conversation, the recoding of language into digitized media. Because one of the things that the coding does that's very, very damaging is it reduces communication fundamentally to basically just 5 signifiers, you know, in Boolean algebra, in the digital language of code and so on. And what gets written out or written over in that context is especially the subjunctive mode in language. And the subjunctive mode in languages refers to all of those forms of speech, all of those practices, linguistics, semantics, semiotic, and so on and so forth, that enable a conversation about the possible rather than the indicative, let's say, which simply tells the facts and so on. And I'm struck by the extent to which that codification of everything, the reduction of everything to code in some way, to algorithm and all of that, is related historically to the division of the world into binaries. You know, you're either for this or against this. You're either progressive or regressive. You're either fascistic or anti-fascistic, and so on and so forth. And these are kind of signs of our times insofar as they have reduced all of the possibility of conversation that we would ordinarily have in summer schools, whether in Florence or in court, which means all of those opennesses to influence that come with interpersonal communication that are kind of written out here. So I'll just make that as a remark by way to start out. And I was also thinking of kind of good words for a subtitle for this, right? So analysis, the gift, and so on, they're in there already. But I'm thinking also of things like influence, conversation, metaphor, metamorphosis, you know, the changing of things out of, in some way, the kind of frozen positions we find the contemporary culture in. And the idea of metanoia, which is the transformation of mind, the transformation of consciousness, and how that in turn is related to what we do here in the summer school, is we're in the business of education, and the origin of education being the educare, which means a turning of the soul. That was Plato's phrase for it. And all of that related to remembering and reminding ourselves and reimagining. So they're kind of some of the key words, I guess, or some of the good words I hope that I want to suggest here as kind of background. Marie, will you give me the next slide, and I'll speak to that one for a moment. So, you know, the paper I've pre-circulated, and the background to this is a discussion in a way of how the contagions that we are presently dealing with, you know, that COVID becomes kind of the main signifier of it, is by no means restricted to that. You know, it says that where that kind of microbiological contagion is actually, you know, a word for other kinds of contagions, ideological contagions, contagions of violence, contagions of scapegoating, and so on and so forth. And that's all represented very well by what we've seen recently happening. The Trump era, let's say, which by no means has kind of gone away. It's still there. That contagion is, as it were, continues to circulate amongst us. And not just Trump, of course, but the many variations of that and so on. So that's one of the contagions that I try to describe in that paper, with all its darknesses and ominous connotations and so on and so forth. But then there's another one, you know, the kind of, what would you call it, the retrovirus, or the kind of antivirus, or the vaccine against all of that. And that's represented by Marcel Mauss's account of the gift, something that's there, something that found expression also during the era that we've just we've lived through in terms of some of its extremities, but we're continuing to live with, and that also we will have to kind of, in other words, take some account of into the future, in the same way as we're living with contagions of violence and sacrifice and scapegoating and so on and so forth, and we'll have to live with that like we live with the virus. There's also a way in which we can talk about, as it were, drawing out those hopeful possibilities and potentials in a sort of a reimagining and a rearticulation and a remembering of, as it were, that social substratum the general economy that is the virtuous spiral of gift relations. Now, so Marie, will you give me the next slide? Thanks. Now, this is Walter Benjamin, and I tried to find a picture of him with flowers, which he has, because if you know him, he was a very, very melancholic guy, and he was, you know, very troubled by the tendencies of totalitarianism of both right and left of his era and so on. And the class war that was part of that as well. And he has a nice piece in the one of the theses on the philosophy of history, I forget which one precisely, where he cites Hegel first about the idea of seek food and shelter first, and higher things, or the good things will be, spiritual things will be given thereafter. So he sort of says, well, behind all of that, there's something going on. And he says, as flowers turn their faces towards the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strive towards the sun that has always rising in the sky of history. And he says, we must try to be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformations. That's very, very interesting, you know, because when we're living in a period of kind of macro events, you know, like, are we in war? Is there a dictatorship? Is there whatever? It's always a tendency in the social sciences to sort of fly to the big signs, you know, and Benjamin is kind of alerting us to something different, something more subtle, you know, the most inconspicuous of transformations. And I want to kind of approach that, if I can, through kind of language and words, and the good word, as in the gift of the good word, and how giving the gift of the good word can be involved in turning things around. That can be kind of the imperceptible tiny thing that works as a sort of an antiviral or a vaccine in some sort of a way. There's also a moment in Benjamin, and I can't find the original quote, but he describes himself to somebody, it's in one of his letters, I think, where he says, I see myself as a sort of a guy who's on a train or a big engine that's running wildly out of control and in danger of going off the rails or crashing in some sort of way. And he says, but the point is to see if you can make a slight adjustment, just the smallest adjustment, and you can change the direction of the whole apparatus. So they're the sort of things I want to see if I can work up a little bit from this. So now, oh, Marie, will you give me the next one? And I want to show this question of, because in previous summer schools, the last one, I think I talked about this, and we've all talked about it, I suppose, in some way or other, the influence of the new media of communication, so digitized social media and so on, the role of Facebook, and all of that is you know, part of this new matrix that creates schisms, that causes and ferments divisions, that engages in scapegoating and so on and so forth. And I tried to identify in particular this strange influence from René Girard through Peter Thiel to Donald Trump. Kind of saying, what's that? You know, like, are people responsible for their influence? We don't want to necessarily say that, you know, somehow René Girard caused all of this in some way, but we can see the way his influence is picked up in some way. Thiel says, you know, this man is the guy who has been the major influence of my life, and I, in turn, become, as it were, one of the key people involved in shaping what we have been living with, and so on. I see Girard maybe as something like, you know, we had to live for a long time with the legacy of Nietzsche's sister mediating his ideas and so on. But that's a complicated story in Girard's term, but I'll just raise it there as a flag. Can you give me the next slide, Marie? And this is a slide that I've showed you before, you know, that what Girard offers, what the influence that that Peter Thiel picks up from Girard is this idea of scapegoating as a safety valve for contagious mimetic violence, right? So there's been a stasis in an internal kind of civil war, sometimes a literal civil war in American culture for the longest time. And the scapegoat mechanism is the thing that might break this stasis. And that's what one of the things that Thiel takes from Girard and Girard passes on to Trump. This is how to do politics now. Fully embrace, don't look for the middle ground, look for the scapegoat, divide, split, and make something new from that. That's Thiel's logic of entrepreneurship as well, which is very interesting. So vengeance and political violence limited by the intervention of authority with a monopoly on violence, you know, so this becomes then the script for the return of the restoration of authoritarianism in law, in whatever. And we see that all over the world at the moment in various restorations of one form or another. The elevation of this and the exercise, if you like, of, fairly naked, brutal power of life over death, you know, this kind of thing. And the elevation of a subject as a monarch belonging to a symbolic order at a great distance above other subjects, an external mediator, and all of this kind of stuff. And you can see how that becomes the features of contemporary politics. Marie, will you give me the next slide? Thanks. And I should have mentioned that iconic kind of photograph of Girard is very interesting there. I think I mentioned this at a previous summer school as well. The symbolic importance of the sword that he's holding there on the occasion of his elevation to the Académie Française and so on. You know, this is power. This is the power of the word. This is the power of the Academy. The Academy was all about the standardization of a particular language of power that would underpin Napoleon's regime as it happened. And then we have the alternative to that. Mauss's famous essay on the gift, written in the aftermath of the war and the Spanish flu, in order to account for all of those positive things that emerge from coronavirus and so on. And then the paper, I give you a small bit of background of that, of Mauss's own influences, his sources of inspiration from his own experiences and so on, both in his role as a soldier in World War I, where he saw all this violence and enmity and all of that kind of thing. He participated himself. He was mostly a translator, interestingly enough. But more crucially, I think, was Mauss's role as a sort of a giver and receiver of care, where he suffered injuries of one sort or another, spent a long time in hospital, incurred a kind of a lifelong, very serious pulmonary illness thereafter, and so on and so forth, and often writes about these, thinks about these practices of care. And reciprocally, he gave care. His wife was, I think, chronically depressed. She also suffered a debilitating illness. He took care of her for 15 years and so on, and all of this. So Mauss's articulation of the gift as a sort of a balm or a sort of a retrovirus against violence comes from those kind of origins. And they expand that using Bataille and some other people to talk about a future-oriented giving up, a life-affirming expenditure investment in intergenerational solidarity to turn the death spiral of late modern utilitarian individualism around. Marie, will you give me the next slide? Please. Marie? Oops. Well, there we go. Okay. Now, you remember we started out this iteration of Economy and Society Summer School with a seminar with this guy, Nidesh Latu, whom I found really, really interesting, and I believe he has a connection with some of us here this morning as well. And what Nidesh Latu is trying to do is to kind of revisit the theme of mimesis. Involving more people in that conversation than just Girard, which is kind of interesting. He kind of counterbalances Girard's emphasis on the darkness and sacrifice and violence and so on and so forth by showing other versions of positive mimesis. In other words, that if mimesis is fundamental and universal and so on, then just as we have bad modeling and bad influences and so on, we can also imagine all of those things that are about good influences. Marie, will you give me the next slide? And one of the sources that he uses here, very interesting guy called Christoph Wolff, and he's a professor of anthropology and sociology at the University of Berlin. And he's really worth taking a look at and so on, because he's one of the people who brings out this very well, that if everything is mimetic, then we can counterbalance that tendency to see always the darkness by looking for those people and ideas that can, as it were, provide us with good models. And one of the crucial things that Wolff does is he shows how mimesis is always a reproduction, but it's not a reproduction of the original. It's a reproduction that brings some variety, brings some possibility, new possibility into the theme. So Wolff and Nidesh show, as it were, the creativity, the potential for creative thinking and reimagining and so on and so forth, that might enable us to think ourselves out of spirals of mimetic sacrificial violence that don't devolve into that kind of crisis, but actually become something else altogether. So that's a very nice re-emphasizing, I think, that demonstrates in itself, because Wolff and Latu and so on read Girard very well, but they show, as it were, maybe that his emphasis, and certainly the way in which he's been taken up by others, tends to emphasize that darkness. So Marie, will you give me the next slide here, and I'll say a little bit more about influence. So here's an interesting pairing, because I was trying to look at, like, well, you know, very influential people in the field and how they build on one another. In this case, the relationship between Judith Butler and Theodore Adorno. And if you kind of think of, just Google them and see how many times they're looked up and so on and so forth. You know, these are kind of the, Adorno wouldn't like it, but these are kind of the celebrities, if you like, of contemporary thinking. And they are both good influences and bad influences. We can see that the problem for Adorno is that his analysis, his critique, I wish Tom were here for this, but his critique is, you know, so totalizing, so destructive. Of course, we have to understand his history as well. He says, only one thing is certain anymore. He says, the irrationality of society has reached a point where only the gloomiest predictions have any plausibility. You know, so if you take on Adorno's influence there, you're kind of frozen. All you can do is, and I've had a lot of difficulty with this, it's easier always to point out the terrible, the bad, the impossible, you know, rather than the other. And Adorno in Minima Moralia, he says, you know, the problem is that wrong life cannot be lived rightly, by which he means something like false, something like that when history is wrong, when history is so, when our times are so damaging and so on, so it's impossible to live the good life. Okay, so Adorno, or I should say, Judith Butler picks this up. She was fairly recently awarded the Adorno Prize, you know, and this is how she responds to that, you know, challenge, like, well, is it the case that we can't live the good life anymore? And she reformulates that in a better way. And she says, well, certainly, you know, what we have to recall is somehow or other that that question isn't, as it were, an individual existential question. It can only be raised and answered and addressed and developed politically. Right? She says, our shared exposure to precarity is but one ground of our potential equality and our reciprocal obligations to produce together conditions for a livable life. That's an interesting line. Our precarity, and of course the last year has, we all live in precarity, but some much more precarious than others, as Orwell might say. But it does remind us, as it were, the shadow of death brings the horizon of life back into sharp focus. That's Zemmel's wonderful line in his view of life. He's dying from cancer. He knows that the end is coming and so on and so forth. And he says, the presence of death you know, serves as a limit horizon from which we can reflect on the seriousness of life and raise again this problem that's a better answer than Adorno's certainty of gloomiest predictions, to say, well, actually take this as an occasion for, as it were, rethinking, reimagining, bringing the importance of life and the possibility of the good life back into focus. Because I guess from Plato to the present, the problem of the good life is we always forget that question. It falls into insignificance. And of course, it falls into obscurity. And this is the problem we really need to ask today. You know, what is the good life? Of course, it's an unanswerable question, but the importance of it is the continuous raising of it, so that it becomes a matter for, as it were, collective conversation and discussion. I think that's Butler's point exactly. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples. How am I doing for time? Marie, will you give me a heads up? Have I got another 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, you absolutely do.
Okay, great. Now, Marie, will you give me the next slide? Thank you very much. Now, so I want to talk about kind of good models, good influences, and so on here. And this is something that one of the things that I find really interesting about Nidesh Latu's work is the way in which he rereads Conrad's work from the point of view of stasis, morbidity, scapegoating, violence, etc., etc. And he wants to show us or provide us with some elements of a language, some elements of a discursive intervention, let's say, that might turn those things around. And there's an interesting parallel between Conrad and Roger Casement. That's where they were contemporaries. They met and they were housemates together in the Congo for a long time. And they're both orphans. They're both, subjects and of empires. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of a crucial conversation, and of course it's lost to the record, but we find traces of it in dialogue and letters and so on and so forth, where Conrad says that Casement was a man who could tell you things I've tried to forget, things that I never did know, and so on. And this was all very disturbing to Conrad, because Casement was the emissary of the British Empire. Conrad was a refugee from the Russian Empire, and Conrad was also an Anglophile, and he thought that that English society, English civilization was the best that it could be, and so on and so forth. So he was very disturbed by this conversation with Casement, who told him things, and in that conversation changed Casement's mind, and so on. So or changed Conrad's mind, I should say. And of course, it's from that Conrad picks up the influence that gives him ultimately Kurtz, I should say, in The Heart of Darkness, and so on. Now, I don't want to say too much about that, but it's a really interesting study in influence, how Casement's conversation changes Conrad's mind and influences him in the formation of this, one of the, as it were, quintessential kind of texts of the problem at the heart of European civilization generally, and the subject of that, the ideal type subject of that civilization in particular. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is that no influence is direct in that way, and it's always diffused and countermanded in some ways, because, as I say, Conrad found this very difficult to swallow, but nonetheless he took it on board, and of course Casement, I don't want to get into the history of that, but Casement was really unable to resolve this problem either of violence and sacrifice. He tried to resolve it through his own self-sacrifice. He thought some heroic military gesture or whatever would be helpful. Then he changed his own mind about that and actually tried to, as it were, stop the insurrection in 1916 and so on. And he saw his own maybe self-sacrifice as some sort of a gift in that way. But anyway, that's for another story. Will you give me the next slide, Marie? Now coming now towards it. Now, I want to suggest to you that here's one of the most amazing studies of contagion, disease, and the spreading of disease, and then how to counteract that with how to do an antivirus of words, as it were. And appears in the pivot chapter, maybe one of the pivot chapters in Ulysses, which is of course the Cyclops episode. And the narrator for that, the speaker for that, is the nameless one. You know, he has no name. We don't know who this guy is. He's I. And it turns out, of course, that what he is a sort of a fly man. He's a fly on the wall. He's a bar fly. He's all of these kind of things. And he's the agent of corruption and contagion. What does he do? He's the agent of metempsychosis, is Joyce's metaphor for this becoming possessed, becoming transformed by the prevailing powerful influences and so on and so forth. But when we meet this guy first, he's having a word with the policeman on the street outside the bar. And then immediately he becomes contaminated by that word. He picks up the contagion and he begins to speak and act like a policeman himself. And he brings this into the pub, and then he spreads. And what we see when we study his speech, all his speech acts in this, all his narrations and so on and so forth, he's basically spreading shit. That's what flies do, you know. So he's spreading gossip, he's corrupting everything, he's picking up a bit from here and there and all of that. And he's no one himself. He's a sort of a nameless guy. We can't see him and so on and so forth. And he's completely consumed by these prevailing powers. He sees everything, spreads filth and corruption, and is interested only in more filth and corruption. Now, what happens in that episode? Well, he walks into the pub. It's already a sort of a little den of resentment and corruption and inadequacy and subaltern, subordinated masculinity. It's a theater of that and so on. And he adds to it, he feeds it, he whatever. And that's where Bloom, of course, enters that bar, and then he becomes subject to it. He becomes subject to the scapegoating. Dublin is filled with divisions and violence, is imperial, religious, nationalist, and so on and so forth. And there's somebody's going to be the scapegoat in that context, of course. And it turns out to be Bloom, the Jew, the presence, and so on. Now, how does Bloom becomes swept up in that conversation? He becomes infected by it himself. And then he tries to turn it around, and he's trying to say, well, yeah, at some point he talks about a crucial moment. He's just been talking about violence and resistance and so on. And then he says, but no, that's no use. He says, well, everybody knows that that's not what life is about. Life is about love and the mimetic possibilities of spreading that. So Joyce, Bloom, is the bearer of the good word. He offers, as it were, and the religious symbolism here is very important. Against the evil of satanic corruption, Bloom speaks, as it were, tries to spread the good word. Now, there's all sorts of things that go against him, and he's got a friend or an accomplice in that, an apostle, maybe something like that, and that's a guy called Cunningham. And Cunningham always tries to find the middle ground, tries to assert civility and politeness and agreement and so on and so forth. But it's not to much avail. And at a crucial point, then Bloom has to say the strong word, the truth. He has to speak truth in this way, and he, as it were, shows that actually the God of the Hebrews is actually the God of the Christians. He states that, but that's not good enough either. Of course, the thing breaks down and into violence and so on, that Bloom and Cunningham both escape from. But he shows us what's necessary in such context to insert, as it were, the positive word, the good word, and the strong word. Right? That's what he's all about. Now, I want to kind of, Marie, will you give me the next slide? I'm just there, almost there. I want to kind of show you maybe versions of influence in a contemporary context, right? So the person behind the New Deal, we associate that always with FDR, right? FDR wasn't an enthusiast for it at all. It was actually a bunch of sociologists, Thorsten Veblen being one of them and others too, but crucially this woman. Her name is Frances Perkins, and she was a sociologist from Columbia, and she lectured there and taught there before and after and so on and so forth. And it was really, the history of the New Deal is having the president's ear. as it were, and which Dorothy Perkins, or Frances Perkins, I should say, did. And that's the ear of, or that's the word of, a sociology that understands, as it were, how to resolve conflicts and so on and so forth by this practice of a new deal. By the way, in terms of her influences, her own influences, I speak proudly as a, I know, half jokingly, at least as a Cork person, because Cork people always imagine that they changed the world. Well, in this case, Dorothy, or Frances Perkins' real influence is a woman called, known now as Mother Jones, who was originally from Cork and so on. I won't get into that. Now, if you think of, you know, good influence, then it's kind of passing along the gift of the good word that assimilates languages of sacrifice and gift and so on, always parlaying towards a general economy. The notion of giving up by the whole community in order to secure its well-being and so on. A contemporary who picks up that tradition from Frances Perkins is, of course, AOC. And it's extraordinarily interesting to listen to her speech, listen to what she does and so on and so forth, because she has, of course, not just the president's ear. She's been the main influence on the Green New Deal and on Biden's recent speech. Biden, as you all know, suffers from two things. He makes gaffes in speech. He says the wrong thing. And the other thing is he's a person who's living with a speech and language disorder. He had a very intense speech impediment as a child, you know, so and lives with that and talks about that and so on. So into that space, as it were, AOC becomes, as it were, the president whisperer. Right, how she shapes and gives him the language and the speech and gives him words, puts words in his mouth and so on. Now that's very interesting because AOC represents that sort of progressive practice of advocation, of reconciliation and so on and so forth that you find in the biography of Marcel Mauss. We think of Marcel Mauss as an academic, as an anthropologist only, and so on and so forth. But Mauss was actually, his life is also characterized by his very active involvement in all sorts of progressive movements of the day. He'd identify himself very strongly with the idea of a sort of a democratic socialist, along the lines that AOC does. Not sure that's might be a bit of a stretch, but I think not. And perhaps maybe Mauss didn't have enough of an ear of Durkheim. Durkheim thought it was the other way around, as Arpit has showed us, that he was dictating. But actually, maybe the most significant influence is actually Mauss's back in the other way. But that's a matter of tracing. And now I'll finish on the last slide. Marie, would you? Yes, thanks. I'm trying to imagine then what an influential conversation might be and how it might need to take place, right? And I've been thinking about this a little bit in terms of this kind of conversation, right? Transgenerational, intergenerational, transatlantic, and so on. What might that begin to speak towards? You know, we could see, for instance, that Ursula von der Leyen speaks a very bureaucratic, juridified language that's completely, as it were, uninspiring. What the EU lacks more than anything else is a sort of a charismatic deficit, right? If you like, a democratic deficit, a legitimation deficit, but you know, the impoverishment of speech into bureaucratic legal proceduralism. She's desperately in need of some good influences in that front. Could those influences come from the charismatic speech of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? That would be an influential conversation. Greta Thunberg is an interesting voice in that as well. And Mary Robinson. I'm just thinking of that as a horizon of possibility of a conversation that could, as it were, mutually influence one another in a beneficial way and also constitute good models towards the future. I've rattled on too long. I'm going to shut up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kieran. No, fantastic. I could rattle on longer. So I can open the conversation to the floor. If Tom is there with his hand up.
I've been here the whole time. I missed the start. I hate to miss the start, but you know, my mind slipped. I must have acquired this amnesia of the days we live in that Kieran mentioned. But yeah, no, but I got it from the good word onwards. I got all of your good words, Kieran. So thanks very much for for that again. It's very interesting. What I find really interesting about this paper and the issues that you raise is, you know, so often sociology is like the work of Adorno, is like German critical social theory, in which it's always there is, you know, it's kind of like the image of, you know, the golem, the machine run out of control, whether it's the state, whether it's the market, whether it's technology, whether it's media, social media, we've become machinized and we're broken, and therefore we have to rediscover community idealized by, you know, from Habermas through to all of these people into some sort of return. And it's interesting, this sort of like the critique of the big machine out there and the desire for this perfect thing, but there's so little talk about what the actual thing is itself, because it's like a return to an ideal community or something. It's a quasi-religious myth. I think it's almost impossible to do sociology without using such large visions and using such broad brushstrokes. Otherwise we're lost in the woods and the trees and so on and so forth. But what I think is interesting is that what you're kind of trying to do here is something like a positive sociology, in which the emphasis is, you know, briefly on the problem and much more about recovering the roots and so on and so forth. And that maybe implies that there's something, I don't know, maybe we have to have our nightmarish visions of Adorno or something like that briefly, but getting lost and addicted to them as a kind of, you know, dubious horror film pleasure or something like that. You know, so I mean, I suppose that is it. I mean, you know, you're our newly minted professor in UCC as well. So as a professor who's been doing sociology for a long time, do you think that we've spent too much time wallowing in the negative, Faustian, tragic, critical vision of modernity? Sociologists need to reorient towards the positive, or not like naively, but yeah, you get my question here.
I agree with all of that. I guess maybe one of the people I mentioned there was Zemel, and that idea of the view of life, right? And he says, you know, you need the dark horizon, the tacit presence of mortality and so on. In his case, of course, it was a real thing, you know, like you need, as it were, some horizon, a dark horizon to sort of bring into focus something that enables you to ask the important question all over again. When Walter Benjamin wrote that, you know, it was almost on the eve of his suicide, right? It was one of the last things he wrote, and his concern is, you know, he was plenty aware of the darkness and the dark vision and so forth, but he said what we really need to do is to sort of be like sunflowers in some way, and to kind of see, well, how can we look for those most imperceptible of all transformations that show a hopeful horizon or a better horizon and so on. And I kind of like that idea, because it's I've had great difficulty doing it myself. It's always easier to, as it were, show the darkness, right, and show another layer of the darkness and how it becomes darker again and so on. So I think the big challenge for sociology of our time is in this little liminal space between past and future. We have some way of addressing that which might be hopeful and so on. And that's why I'm kind of trying to focus there on the conversation, the word, and spreading the good word, right? Because when we look at that piece from Ulysses, you know, you couldn't have a grimmer picture. The guys are stuck in the cave, right? And all around them outside the cave are even more larger threatening powers, you know, the empire, the church, commerce, and so on and so forth. And it's starting, as it were, in the Yeats's phrase, the foul rag and bone shop, as it were. You know, how can you, as it were, speak and introduce the good word into that and salvage it from conversation that might become the basis for a positive mimesis that would counteract and also propagate something entirely new. So the critique is there and necessary, but we can't, we're frozen in it, as you yourself argue, Tom, very, very well. It's become now part of the problem and not enough of a solution. You know, Adorno is trapped himself in his own corner. He can only say the grimmest possible things, right? So, and Judith Butler, at least she's well aware of all that stuff too, but she says, how can we turn things around? Do you know that she's had a recent feature in Time magazine, you know, talk about kind of being influential in some way, and I'm not sure if you, whatever, but she chooses that space, you know, in the most conventional, the most, as it were, hegemonic kind of space, you know, or the general discourse. And she says, well, actually, in this place, we might need to say something new.
There's a question just in from Arpad, and then a comment from Antoinette. Arpad.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me now?
Yes, I do.
Okay, okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Kieran. This is an excellent presentation, covering so many themes. I cannot, I have several questions, but I just want to focus on one particular issue, which just joins also with Tom's question, and in fact, which is just taking up the last word which you mentioned about the something new. Now, my sort of comment and question is the following. You in particular refer to Plato and metanoia, and of course the good life, that is again Plato. But Plato has another very fundamental word, which is a kind of equivalent to metanoia, not equivalent, but a kind of synonym of metanoia, which is also conversion. Foucault gave a lecture about Plato's metanoia as basically the source of the Christian idea of conversion, which is quite interesting. But anyway, the other word of Plato is periagoge. And it is this word, periagoge, which I think you also used in some of his other papers. You certainly know about that, which is central for the cave metaphor, among others, in the Republic. And now what this implies is the turning back. And I think this is a very important point, because we cannot just have something new. We cannot run forward. Now, of course, we need to come up with some sort of, I don't know how to formulate solution, way out, you know, something positive in this kind of terrible situation which we are getting ever more in. But what I would say, and this is really kind of, this is where I have a radically different point to whether Adorno or Butler or all these people, is that what we need to recognize is that we need to turn back. Sorry about that. And this turn back implies the entire modern project. We cannot just run forward. We cannot sort of change the track, but somehow we must get the recognition. And many people are gaining this recognition that we need to turn back. Let me just give one more example about that. And this related to, you know, communism and Marxism and all these kind of things. And I remember a talk by Richard Sackvar anyway, where the issue was basically, okay, so now we have Stalin, so we have to turn back to Lenin. I mean, we or they. Okay, now Lenin is not enough, we have to turn back to Marx. Well, Marx is not good, we have to turn back to Hegel. Well, Hegel is not good, we have to turn back to Kant. Now, all of this is just one particular lineage, but that is not enough, because Kant, Hegel, Marx, all of these people are still too modern. And not just for my liking, but I think somehow this is the central issue. Of course, we need to go out, but we cannot go ahead unless we realize that we need to turn back. And it is there that I see a kind of absolute dividing line, which doesn't imply to, you know, reject everything, because that's as bad as any of the other revolutions. But if this message is not, maybe this is the message that we have to get across, that we have to solve all kinds of things, but we need to turn back. If you don't realize it, you know, the zero from walking to slow food, the same idea is there. We need to turn back, sorry, full stop. And then we might find, and you know, this is what walkers know. I mean, if you lose your track while walking, you might cut across, and then you get into a, whatever it is, you know, a higher mountain on a kind of, how you call it, wedge that you cannot cross. No, you have to turn back, and then you can see where you have gone wrong. Otherwise, it's all talk. But anyway, that's my question, whether you agree with that or whether you...
I do, with a small tweak. I'd refer to it more as turning around rather than turning back, if you know what I mean, because I guess my spirit guide for this turning around is Vico. and Vico as picked up through Joyce and so on. You know, how do you turn the conversation around? How do you turn the world around, and so on, rather than you know, so Vico through Joyce, etc., says something like, you know, when we're confronted with the problems that are evidently before us, we always are inclined to think that we need to imagine something entirely new, you know, come up with something new, come up with a new idea, and so on and so forth. And it's in that context because Vico, I think, is responding to Descartes in it, and he sees already, you know, the kind of the binary world that's going to emerge and so on and so forth. And Vico is kind of saying, actually, you know, instead of that, let's turn around and imagination isn't, as it were, the coming up with something new, but the working over always of what is remembered. You know, so the working over of memory becomes, as it were, grounds for imagination. And I think that's what Nidesh Latu has in mind as well, with something, what does he call it, the mimesis reloaded, you know, which, and Wolf too, this idea of like, well, variation comes into the world we by, as it were, this working over of the inheritance. So we live in a world of inheritances, some of them terribly bad and terribly modern, that we have gone some terribly wrong in some sort of a way. But there's also some of that legacy that might be of value to us, so long as we remember it and work it over and reimagine it, so long as we're prepared to do that. And I think, for instance, if I just might mention these people, when I look at the EU and what it is through the speech of Ursula von der Leyen, for instance, you know, she finds herself to be trapped in a language that's sterile, that's bureaucratic, that's is problematic in all sorts of ways. Where I see people, Greta, for instance, always declares the emergency, that we must, you know, turn back in some way. She's the degrowth person and so on and so forth. There's a lot of value in that. But what AOC seems to do is, as it were, not just revisit, but rethink, reimagine as a way of changing our course. So I both agree with you, but my emphasis would be just on the, as it were, not the turning back, but the turning around.
Thank you. I think I mean it in the same way, or more or less.
Okay.
I mean, this is also the question of Renaissance, in fact, because what did the Renaissance do?
Yeah.
The Renaissance turned back in a way, very seriously turned back to antiquity, and not just that. And then in that sense, it was, that's what I think we are talking about the same thing. So thank you.
Thank you. I thought we were.
Okay, so Antoinette, and then we have Jody, Amin, and Irina.
Well, thank you. That sounds very interesting, and I really enjoyed your paper. I just had an observation there when you were, and a comment when you were talking the four ladies on screen. When you have somebody like Michael D. Higgins, so sociologist, politician, president,
yeah,
does he become the government whisperer? I mean, probably not in our political situation, but then is he society's whisperer? He, you know, speeches, conferences, books, his writing, interviews on the Late Late Show. He's really getting out there, and sometimes people are saying, you know, stepping outside the boundary of the president's role. So is he our society's whisperer? And what do you think about that?
Okay, absolutely. You know, Michael D is kind of the sort of animating spirit behind our summer school too. He launched us some 5 years back and so on. And he does all of that, and he's a wonderful representative of that, the power of speech and the power of words. And in fact, one of his very first things in office as president was to address, I think he was speaking in Columbia or one of the American universities, where, you know, attentive to Trump's use of words, which was all the scapegoating and all the rest. Michael D was talking about kind of to be very careful about the use of words, because words really, really matter You know, they begin to, as it were, filter the language in such a way that only some forms of speech are acceptable. I was talking to a friend of mine in NYU some time ago, and he said the most dangerous thing about that era was when the president says it, people say, "Oh, the president says it. You know, I can speak like that too." So if the president is racist, or if the president is sexist or homophobic or whatever, it is very enabled all of that kind of speech. So it becomes very important in that context then to pay close attention to language. You probably also know that when Leo Varadkar, who is of course the voice of neoliberalism in Ireland, an extremely radically conservative voice, dressed up and disguised in all sorts of ways and so on and so forth, but Michael D tried to get his ear. You know, so he set up a series of meetings and so on with him, but kind of to no avail, you know, so, or at least a little avail, we don't know, you know, to kind of trace that influence and so on. But I guess this is again the importance of that moment in Ulysses where, you know, the good word is one thing, but it has to be also kind of given that symbolic surplus of the strong word, right? You know, I can't seem to influence you here by my soft words, by my kind words about love, for instance, or by my civil words that Martin Cunningham represents in the thing. But I'm going to tell you this now, you are completely wrong. You know, so he speaks truth to power in that sense. Bloom does in that context. And the president is limited in his speech, right? Because people, the media, especially the standard mouthpieces of neoliberalism in Ireland, the Independent, for instance, Independent, my ass, and the Times, you know, and so on. Great difficulty managing that, but yes, as a sort of a model and the practitioner of this, he shows both the importance of it and also that curious balance between the good word, the kindly word, super important, you know, as an alternative to the harsh word, the vicious word, the evil word, and so on and so forth, and also the importance of the strong word. Benjamin says also in those theses on the philosophy of history that we have to remember that the Redeemer, the Messiah, comes to the world not just as a word to redeem the world, but also as the slayer of the Antichrist. You know, so that combination of the good word, the kind word, the love word, let's say, and also the strong word is the very, very delicate balance to find.
That's great, thank you.
If that helps.
Yeah, you do see sometimes he starts with the good word, and then if he really believes in something, he will push towards, you know, the strong word.
I completely agree, but all I'm saying is that it's that kind of combination of the kindly word and the strong word, carefully crafted. You know, he writes and rewrites and reworks all his own speeches, right? And always it's infused with strong sociology. He doesn't shy away from strong ideas, strong theories, you know, even though people aren't prepared to kind of hear that, you know,
thank you.
Jody Moore.
Hi, thanks, Ray. Thanks so much, Kieran. That was really interesting. I suppose I just have a question about good words in our current climate, where we have such a ubiquity of information, particularly on the internet and social media and the media, the news media. There seems to be people claiming to have good words that are contradictory to other good words. You know, AOC says she has a good word.
Yeah.
And then people denounce her, you know, and say that she's vacuous and mercenary. And how can we determine, you know, what is really a good word in this current climate? And you know, where I think, like I say, the ubiquity of information that we all have access to creates such doubt in us. You'd think that kind of our rational modern society would reduce doubt, but I think it increases it, you know, and yeah, so, you know, do you have any ideas or answers for that, for all of these good words that are contradicting each other, and how we can determine, you know?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and a really kind of challenging problem, right, that we kind of have to face, because, you know, it isn't as if there's the last word or the definitive word or anything like that. There's only always the question of raising the question of the good, right? And that's, let's say, if we wanted to salvage something from Adorno's legacy, it would be that insistence that he has of, you know, raising the question of the good, right? You know, I have the logo up there for Sustainable Development Goals, right? The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are kind of laudable in some way, but actually when you get down into them, they dissolve pretty quickly into, you know, a kind of a jargon, a rhetoric, and so on. They lack that kind of charismatic or sublime, inspirational quality, and they need to be enlivened with that as well. Now, but all I can say is that perhaps what we must do now as sociologists is to keep that question of the meaning of the good life alive, and raise it always and consistently where it can be raised and where it ought to be raised. You know, so we can't presume any longer, you know, that sociology is the source of the good word, because sociology has also been corrupted and fragmented and impoverished and so on and so forth. There's a proliferation of books and titles and articles and so on out there, mostly about triviality, mostly about shallow ideas and so on and so forth. Philosophy similarly has lost the ability to raise for the most part, lost the ability to raise the question of the good life, which is the only question, right? Instead it devolves into sort of analytic logic games and so on. Listening to a philosophy conference and just be saddened by the banality of what goes on in that discourse. You know, mind games and mind puzzles and so on. And this goes back to what I was suggesting earlier about the way in which, and while I praised Cork just a little while ago as its influence on Francis Perkins and so forth, Cork is also responsible for George Boole and the impoverishment of language and discourse and the shallowing out and emptying out of everything to a reduction to 5 symbols that is the bane of life at the present. So against all of those kind of things, right, and against the ambiguities and against, you know, the charge and countercharge and so on and so forth, what kind of intervention can one make? You know, and I would suggest that, puzzled by that and challenged by that, it might be to raise again and again and again the question of the good. Find the moment in the conversation where, you know, you can say, well, how is this conversation, whether in politics or in philosophy or wherever, oriented towards the good, right? And then, of course, that creeps up the question, well, what do we mean by the good? Well, certainly we don't mean by the good something like simply, you know, an algorithmatized world, or, you know, a return to normal. You know, that's one of the most frightening possibilities we have at the moment, that any day now we'll be returning to normal. Are we going to build back better? That's bullshit. And that, of course, is exactly where, you know, sociology should be consistently entering into the discourse. But there's so many things against that, right? The voice of sociology is completely overwritten at the moment by the code of psychology, you know, the individualizing code of psychology. So everything becomes a matter of, you know, well, you know, how does this individual think of the future? How can we nudge their rational choices in a particular kind of way, and so on? It's a terrible problem, but you will be. It's still important to be the voice in the wilderness. I'm sorry for using the kind of religious language, but that's where it begins with Benjamin and so on and so forth. You know, well, you know, is it better to be still the voice in the wilderness saying something, and that question has to be about the good and the good life and the possibility of the good life, than to be beaten into silence?
Fantastic. We're over 11 now, so I know some people will be filtering out, and that's, you know, entirely fine. But we have 2 more questions and a comment, and we might wrap it up there. So, Amin.
Yes, hello, thank you very much, Kieran, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think you answered one of questions related to Girard's theory, the scapegoating mechanism. Girard's theory particularly sacrificed and the scapegoat or goating mechanism respond to the situation in which he elaborated it. I mean, for example, the outburst of violence in modern societies, which went hand in hand with the transition of industrial to post-industrial societies. Perhaps Girard's theory even implied a suggestion of how to overcome the crisis. A suggestion, however, that has to be taken with care. I think Marcel Mauss in his book, The Gift, give a better solution to the crisis, which one you have already mentioned in your presentation, and I think that is a better answer for the crisis.
Thank you, Amin. When this began to happen, let's say about this time last year or whenever, you know, I was kind of struck by the tension between the Girardian account of the world, which offers such great explanatory power. This is how we can really see what's going on here, this kind of contagious, mimetic spiraling into violence and hostilities and siloing and all the rest. And Mauss's, right? There's so much that needs to be filled in the middle, of course, because there's a lot of ambiguity. You know, is the resurrection of, as it were, the restoration of the authority to medical science that comes out of this, is one of the consequences of that. Is that good or bad? Is it better that we believe Anthony Fauci, for instance, his account of the world, than Donald Trump's account of the world, or, you know, the people who say Jesus is my vaccine and all of this kind of thing? So highly ambiguous how they might be reconciled. And I was trying to sort of find that in the paper, towards the end of it at least, trying to find some sort of a version of how they're both important voices in speaking to our times, but the voice that's less heard is the Maussian voice, right? You know, so and they've mentioned that previous summer schools about this, the role of Thiel and so many other people who, you know, the Facebook oligarchs and so on and so forth, how they are in the business basically of spreading the evil word, of causing this division and so on. So that's kind of, I'm trying to now, as a sort of a follow-up to it, talk up, as it were, the other account, the Maussian account, in a way that is some grounds for hope. Because I have to say, one of my own difficulties through this year was I was very animated and I don't want to say excited in a good sense, but like, let's say, no sociologist could live through this past year without being gripped by suddenly we need to make some effort to formulate what's going on here, because otherwise there's just the noise of the media, there's just the shouting voices of elections, and there's the bureaucratic voices of NEFIT and so on and so forth. We need a better way to speak about that. But I found myself drawn to the voice, or speaking only with the voice of a kind of Adorno there, you know, like that things are so bad that, you know, the only thing you can add to the conversation is look at how bad things are, right? And I've struggled with kind of saying I cannot speak in that voice anymore, because it's the hegemonic voice. We need to find other possibilities. And that's kind of how I got interested in Butler's way in which she picked him up, and picked up the importance of re-asking that conversation, re-asking the question that Adorno seemed to have abandoned at that point, you know. yeah, I suppose Ray introduced me as a professor, and I don't know how to wear that mantle yet, but I know that the difference between a lecturer and a professor is something like a lecturer reads and reiterates in some ways the ideas of others, right? And that can mean when the field is so dominated by the negative that you're just adding more negativity, right? Whereas a professor, profess means you have to propagate some new, more hopeful set of ideas. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I'm going to try to see if I can do that.
Thank you.
Irina, and then Verdi, if you want to maybe read your comment, or you can, I'll read it for you, but Irina first.
Thanks, Ray. Kieran, thank you. I'm always surprised how, you know, different ideas come together, and then you kind of go, oh wow, I haven't thought about that. So thank you. It's amazing to kind of be inspired by conversations. And my comment, maybe it's not a fully kind of conceptualized either, because it's more, and I think I told that already before in our conversations, that it takes me a wee while to process it all and put it into kind of a coherent stream of thought. At the moment, I'm reading a book by David Abram, The Spell of Sensuous, and I was just reading this, The Spell of Sensuous, and it this morning, it was a chapter on words and how language developed, and how we actually use the symbolic meaning of words first. So the way you have the symbol of the global, the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, that they are symbolized by actually nature. And that the words were always in relation to what we are going through in terms of our being in the world. So, and then I was thinking about these kind of, you know, moments of plagues and what we have from history to learn about that. And straight away, I remember the Boccaccio's, you know, the Decameron, and telling stories. And it's a word, it's about the word that he's inviting us to do, but it's telling in the nature. Albert Camus, Plague, once again, you know, it's about going through, but it's those moments that saves it is about when they look at the sea, when they go swimming, when they are in the conversation. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you see that kind of obsession with the current way of word as this rational thinking, and actually thinking about the word, that it's a conversation where you are constantly adjusting to the presence of not necessarily nature per se, but in the moment that you're living, rather than constantly thinking the world and being in the world. So just a thinking that is going on at my head at the moment.
Irina, thank you for the gift of your comment, and that book, which, can you please send it to me later, because that's kind of extraordinarily interesting. I mean, one of the keys that I got me thinking in this direction was the etymological root and also in usage between influenza, you know, and COVID, of course, is a variant of an influenza, flu, and so on and so forth, and influence, right? You know, so that they and it's imperceptible, but and then of course you get the idea of the variation, the mutation of the virus, and so on and so forth. So these are kind of metaphors for helping us kind of think a little bit about what's going on in the flow, as you say, of conversation. That's why going back to, you know, why we set up this summer school back in the day and so on, and the usefulness of it and the joy of it, you know, is exactly in that conversation and the way in which we influence one another in that context, and at some points change one another's minds and give each other kind of new ideas, not that they're entirely new with their work and in some way, and they let us see the world in a different kind of way and so on. Now, that takes us back, of course, to the protocols of social distance, which have been so important, at least in the kind of language of biopower that has managed this situation and so on and so forth, but also the incredibly destructive damage that does, you know, and the work of recuperation and recovery that any sort of post-COVID world will have to be much more attentive to and much more careful of, which is that world of the kind of ocean of discourse, the ocean of language. Who's it? Baudelaire says that very nicely. The person who takes a bath in the multitude, right? You know, as one of the possibilities of contemporary society, by which he means kind of immersing yourself in the conversation of others and allowing oneself to be influenced by that. But the problem is, of course, the main currents of that influence are so problematic. The rational discourse, as you say, expressed in all the emphasis on coding, the economic discourse with insistence on a particular kind of a subject, homo economicus, for instance, you know, how can that be turned around? How can that be converted into something else? This is the work that remains for us, will require that we urgently try to address in the future. I love your use of reference to several major literary figures. One of the things that I think is going on during this period is quietly in the background, writers have been writing. And I think we probably, hopefully find that one of the legacies of this will have been a sort of a reflection, a returning into oneself, a thinking through artistically and creatively. Of course, artists and so on have been particularly sidelined and silenced and damaged by this. So one of the things maybe we'll have to do is to be attentive to that imperceptible, quiet conversation that's been happening all around us. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks for everybody for staying with us. So we've one final question from Verdi, and we have a comment in the chat from Elizabeth wondering why there isn't a sociologist on the Climate Change Advisory Council, but I'll pass it over to Verdi. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. And just say, Kieran, congratulations on becoming professor. I didn't know that, and I would suggest you park the negative thoughts on it, and perhaps you can become the professor of hope and possibility. I think that would sit very well with you. My kind of query question is about that as a student services professional, I feel the burden and the tension between what the university wants sometimes and what's good for the students. And what I want to talk to you about is the role and responsibility of universities in this conversation as a whisperer, and the role to assist in creating the good life. And I think this year, with the pandemic, of the thousands of undergrads who've had a very poor experience, and they've lacked that contact, that human contact. And you speak about recuperation. We talk all the time in marketing terms of being truly inclusive. And in my written query there in the chat, I said about experiment and experience have the same Latin root, to gain knowledge through repeated trials. And it has definitely been a trial for the young, particularly first years, who haven't had that experience of the university life. So I feel that the pandemic has revealed that university was never about education. It's the kind of neoliberalist bit, and that without the experience, education alone seems insufficient. So I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Vico, how do you suggest we turn around the conversation in the university going forward, and our role as positive mimesis?
God, thanks for that wonderful comment, Rich, and your question at the end, which I wish I had a better answer to. I'll just say a couple of things that might in some way be helpful there, which is something like we need now to remember, work over and reimagine the grounds and the horizons of what the university has been that has become impoverished, because you know, the grounds and horizons of the university are something like the symposium, you know, as that kind of conversation and so on. And of course, we imagine the school, this summer school, in exactly that way. A symposium, a collegium also, you know, a colloquium, and all of this, you know. So this is kind of the grounds, you know, the grounds in conversation and exchange, and the gift of knowledge and words and so on to one another, and all of that kind of thing. So that's one thing that we need to constantly re-articulate and, as it were, remind the university of, to stand against its tendency to roll into further and further layers of kind of rationality and administration and so on. You know, because the student experience is crucially important for them. What is the student experience? My son is in UCC at the moment, and he's in a student accommodation and so on, and he's missing all of those things that you describe. And at the same time, they're trying to recreate it in-house, you know, like conversations amongst each other and so on. And I noticed, for instance, that he stopped calling us lately, right? You know, and I see that as a good sign, because actually it shows, you know, it's a kind of an indicator that there is actually a rich life still going on. Students are creating it themselves. They're involved in debates and arguments and little affairs and so on in residence, and they're living the life of the student experience. That's hugely important. The other thing that we have to defend and re-articulate all the time is the horizon of ideas that the university represents, as in the university is an idea, you know, because what the university has to do is in the business of, that's what universe and university means. It means something like those things that are that are universal, horizons that we should all kind of agree to or aspire to agree to. Of course, it's an impossible horizon. Of course, there's no such thing as those absolutes and so on. But that's why that question framed and reframed by Adorno is kind of important to us. You know, like, well, is it possible to live the good life when everything around us is wrong? And to take that down to the level of the university is it possible to be a university student, to have a meaningful, meaning-making university experience when all around us we're surrounded and overwhelmed by the logics and codes of, and sometimes the false rhetorics about inclusivity and so on. So it comes back to the same thing. The raising of the question and the insistence of the raising of the question. You know, what is the good of a university? What ideals does it really aspire to? One of the languages that has really driven me insane in the last 10 years is the way in which education gets recoded as training, right? So the university isn't involved in education in the sense that I meant it. It's involved in training. Well, you know, you train dogs and horses and soldiers, you know, you educate students and people and citizens and so on. So how do we do that? Well, at every possible forum, you have to try to get that word in, remind people, because I don't want to presume that senior university administrators, senior management, how that language, for instance, has entered senior management, you know, that's a frightening kind of talk, right? But how can you engage with senior management and kind of speak truth to power in that context? How can you show them that there's a better language? How can you show them that what they really should be in the business of is, as it were, re-articulating and making possible the grounds of a meaningful, meaning-making experience, and aspiring to ideas of the good life that are other than technocratic, careerist, individualistic, and so on.
Strong words. Fantastic. Thanks, Kieran. So just a reminder that the SAI starts tomorrow and that we have Damien O'Doherty next Tuesday at 10 a.m. for our final ENS of this season. So just thanks a million, Kieran, for a wonderful talk, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kieran.
Very welcome. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
This was all about.
Thank you, Kieran. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. It was great. Cheers.
Very
It's
welcome.
really interesting. Bye.
Thank you, Kieran. That was beautiful.
Okay.